So I asked the first service this. I'll be intrigued to see if second service's response is any differently. How many of you would describe yourself as a person who likes surprises? Any hands going up? So people are like, I think they were nervous at first service, like, is he about to do something then to surprise us? And no, that wasn't really the idea. I'm just curious if you identify yourself as a person who likes them or not. Now, my answer would be it depends on the surprise, right? Maybe that's what some of you were thinking. Now, I mean, there's certain surprises that I love. I don't know if I can't remember. I'll have to ask myself or my wife later on, but I don't know that I've ever been part of a surprise party. Like one of those traditional ones where you hide in the corner and then jump out and yell surprise at someone. Maybe some of you guys have done that. I don't know that I've ever actually done that, but I'd like to be part of that kind of surprise. I think that would be fun to do to someone. And then, has anyone ever gone on a surprise trip or surprised someone with a trip? See a couple of hands go up with that one. We did that to our kids once, and it was a lot of fun. We told them, actually, that we were taking them to the doctor and that they had to go get shots. They were young, okay? And we loaded them up in our van, and we drove them, and at a certain point, they're like, is this too long? Like, where are we going? And then all of a sudden, we pulled into the entrance to Great Wolf Lodge Water Park, and their eyes just, like, got bright, and we pulled the suitcases out from the back. They were happy. They were surprised that time, right? So there are surprises that we love, and then there's the surprises that we don't like. Like when your car breaks down. Does anyone get excited about that surprise? Probably not. When you get a bill in the mail that you didn't know was coming, no one's happy about that surprise? No. It's this second category that Peter's talking more about in his epistle, right? He sits there and he starts to talk about the sufferings that surprise us. And the question he wants us to examine this morning is, why does suffering surprise us? In verse 12, he says this. He says, "Beloved, don't be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you." And I listen to those words, and I get it. Okay, Peter, you say, don't be surprised. But then how do you describe the suffering? As a what? A fiery trial. So why does suffering surprise us? Because it hurts so much. Because it's so intense. I mean, there's certain like routine things that happen in life, and you're like, okay, that wasn't pleasant, but you just kind of go on throughout your day. But then there's the things that we think of as suffering or fiery trials, and it surprises us how much it hurts sometimes. It is difficult. And yet Peter says that we need to kind of brace ourselves and be ready, because our world is surrounded in suffering. Certainly the world that Peter is talking to was surrounded in suffering. There were lots of different ways they suffered back then. I mean, you think if someone got sick back in Peter's time, you couldn't just go to the doctor and ask for a prescription for an antibiotic, could you? There were no antibiotics. And actually, there weren't even a whole lot of quality doctors back then either, were there? They actually say that, according to historians, the infant mortality rate during this time in the world was somewhere between a quarter and a third of all babies in the first year. They knew suffering, didn't they? If there was a natural disaster, it was just upon yourself and the goodwill of maybe people around you if you lost everything. And if you lost your job, there was no unemployment to provide checks while you were waiting to get back on your feet. There was suffering constantly upon them. And we look at those things, and then maybe you sit there and say, okay, well, maybe I just need to be tougher or whatever, because, oh my goodness, the suffering was so hard back then. But I'm not saying for this to minimize our own suffering. Do we still experience suffering today? Yeah, and is it still intense? Absolutely. I mean, so we can sit there and say, okay, maybe we don't have an infant mortality rate like that, but does everyone still die? Yes, that's still a truth. And whether a person dies young or a person dies at 90 years old after a long, good life, is there still suffering involved? Yes. Because it does not matter how the person dies necessarily. There is still some kind of pain or brokenness involved when we sit there and we look and we say, man is not meant to die. Like the world sometimes tells us this false truth. Oh, it's just a natural thing. But it's not. And our insides know that. That since Adam and Eve sinned, that brokenness entered the world. And so people die and we suffer when it happens. And well, we can go to good doctors and get good antibiotics. Does that mean that all the illnesses and ailments are just taken away now? Do we have less of those than they used to? No. And sometimes I think we almost suffer more because we're so used to doctors and antibiotics being able to just deal with it. So that when we get a chronic illness or a chronic pain, or there's someone around us who has those things, then there's something inside us that says, that's so wrong. Surely we can fix it. If I go to enough doctors and I take enough medicine, they've got to fix it, right? And they can't always. And so sometimes we suffer then that much more because it seems so wrong. And while we certainly have more possessions and maybe a broader social support system to take care of us and things to surround us with, the levels of happiness in our world are certainly no higher than they were back then. In fact, as much as we can tell, studies say that we live in one of the least happy generations that the world has ever seen. And so is there still suffering? Yes. Is it just as real today as it was then? Yes, just as intense, I would say. And so suffering hits us. And when it hits us really hard, sometimes then it surprises us. But I also think suffering is hard for us because it oftentimes comes from unexpected sources. There's certain places where you kind of expect, okay, suffering could come from that realm, but then sometimes it comes in strange ways and strange places. Again, at the beginning, what does Peter say? He says, don't be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. He uses this word strange intentionally, okay? Because just a couple chapters before, he said that when you become a Christian in your world, then they consider you strange, or foreign, or different. And that caused suffering to the people Peter was writing to. He's writing to a largely Gentile audience, and what that means is that they were part of the culturally dominant group in their area, all right? They were used to going to temple with their friends and with their family and worshiping all the same gods and having all the same festivals and doing all the same things. And so they were on the inside. They were just part of every regular day. And then when they became Christians, what happened? They became outsiders, and they suffered. And the very people who were their friends and family, who looked on them as just part of the group, all of a sudden treated them like outsiders, and they took their jobs away, and they took their property away, and they looked down on them and called them names and pushed them to the edges of society. And so those people that had been family and friends now had become seemingly enemies. And when that kind of thing happens, there's suffering, isn't it? When it comes from this unexpected source. And when they suffer because they're Christians, because they're holding on to the cross, it seems strange to them. Verse 16 says this, yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. In fact, when it says, if you suffer as a Christian, what is the assumption? That if you are a Christian, you what? Will suffer. For doing what? For being a Christian and doing Christian things. And that seems strange, doesn't it? Like they're like, but if I'm being kind and trying to be a Christian in my world, and then that results in me suffering because of it, that's not a normal message most religions preach, but it's the Christian message. The Christian message sits there and says that sometimes we suffer precisely because we are a Christian. And we sit there and we kind of chafe against it because we're like, well, we're part of the world. And man, as long as we go along with the world and as long as we go along with the dominant culture, they embrace us. But then once we stamp outside it a little bit, once we sit there and say we want to embrace kind of the biblical worldview and these things that God says are right and good, sometimes even when we're doing these things that seem like they're right and good, the world will call us wrong or bad. And will suffer. And you sit there and you think, man, it seems so natural and so good and so right for us to say, I'm going to stand up for the rights of every single innocent life wherever it might be found, including all the way back into the womb. And yet, as we sit there and we stand up and say, let's do that, let's care for everyone, then the world says you're being evil and you're oppressing people. That seems strange. As we sit there and we say, okay, God's got a worldview that says that sexuality is this beautiful thing, and let's place it there within the bounds of marriage so that it can be cherished and wonderful. And then we sit there and we say, okay, I think God's got a great plan, and then we're called bigots or prudes or something like that. Or we sit there and we think, man, God's grace has been so profound for me in my life. and I am chief of sinners. Let's just say it. But God has had such incredible grace for me. He's forgiven me time after time after time. And so I want everyone to know that same grace that God has shown me through Jesus. And so we say, let's go out into the world, and no matter where people come from or what they are or what religion they came from in the past, let's go ahead and tell them about Jesus because we want them to have Jesus too. And then the world says, but if you do that, you're basically just a cultural colonialist, and you're trying to be superior to others. And we say, but no, I think I'm just trying to do something kind and loving. But we'll suffer for it. You see, these things then strike us sometimes as strange, don't they? And the suffering hits us because it's coming from these unexpected sources and unexpected ways. And part of the reason that it probably hits us in a strange way is because we don't even see who's underneath it all, that First Peter identifies, right? He says what? Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Sometimes suffering hits us because we don't see who's underneath it all. We look on the world and we see the media or people or someone out there as our enemies, and what does Peter say? They're not really your enemies. They're just people. It's Satan who's underneath it. That's the mastermind of it all. And he's looking for Christians every single day. He's not even so worried about the people who aren't Christians. He's especially worried and focused on you. And so he's following around every single day trying to pull us away from Jesus. And one of the ways he does it is by causing suffering. So those are some reasons that we might be surprised, aren't they? And what is Peter's message to us? What does he keep going back to again and again and again? This really countercultural message. He says, rejoice insofar as you share Christ's suffering, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you're insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. He says, I want you to sit there and to think about suffering all the time as a way that your suffering actually reflects Jesus' suffering. And man, did Jesus suffer? Yes, right? Like his entire life is one of suffering from his birth all the way up until he's sitting there and he's going out and ministering, and every single Jewish leader is sitting there and opposing him and telling him that he's wrong. And it goes wrong time after time after time when he sits there and he's preaching the gospel, and then they push back that much harder on him as he's going and preaching the gospel of forgiveness of sins, all the way to the point where then they get one of his friends to betray him, the rest of his friends to abandon him and run away, and then he is suffered, he's crucified, and he dies. Talk about suffering, right? What Peter says then is, if Jesus suffered, then what's probably going to happen when we follow in Jesus' feet? We're probably going to what? Suffer too. He says, expect it. See that it's going to happen. But here's the thing. When Jesus suffered, what happens with the suffering? God turns it into something good. That's the point. He says, when Jesus suffers, he's actually exalted, right? That one of the crazy things that we think about is, okay, what makes God the most amazing, wonderful being, right? What makes God his most godlike or shows God at his most godlike? And we're tempted to think, oh, it's the miracles, right? Like when he turned all that water into wine, or when he turned all those, he took a couple loaves of bread and a couple of fish, right? He turned it enough to feed thousands and thousands of people. Oh, there's God and his most amazing, right? Well, that's God. But when was God at his most godlike? When he was on the cross, right? When he sat there and he took the sins of all of humanity upon himself, and he poured out grace to every single one of us. That was God in his most godlike, because that was when his love shone forth the clearest and the greatest for every single one of us. That's what God does with suffering. He turns it into glory. He turns it into something good. God took the old rugged cross, as the song says, right? That emblem of suffering and shame, and he turns it into the most beautiful thing for all of humanity. And so he says to every single one of us, follow after Jesus. Follow after him, not in the way that your suffering is going to forgive your sins or forgive the sins of another person. But he says, follow after Jesus and know that God is going to do something good with your suffering in the end. Now, we don't always see all of it. I was talking with someone between services about that. And it's like, well, what's the point of this one or that one? And the answer is, I don't know. Now, he does say that he'll use it. He does say sometimes that the fiery trial can become a test and do something good with it. He says even within this world, earlier in Peter, he talks about using it to refine us, right? Like gold or silver gets refined and gets some of the impurities out. And God does that. He can do that with any suffering that we experience. And then there's whole levels of things that God is doing with our suffering that, guess what? We'll never even know. And yet we trust in this God who did something so amazing through Jesus' suffering, that he's doing something good with ours too. And while we're experiencing it then, what do? He has this beautiful answer. He says, while you're suffering, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God so that at the right time he can exalt you as you cast all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. So while we're suffering, instead of going to God and being like, I'm surprised, what does he say? He says, go to God and cast those anxieties and cares on him. Constantly throw them at the feet of Jesus, whatever it is. And a lot of times we kind of sit there and we're like, okay, there's a certain level of anxiety and care I'll just take on myself, God, right? But what does God say? No, cast all your anxieties on him. Not 50%, right? 25%, 75%. What percentage does God want us to give him? 100%. He says, cast them all. And we do that on a regular basis, right? We talk to God. I mean, most of us probably talk to God at night. Most of us probably talk to God at meal times. And God says, great, fill up the rest of your time with prayer too. Whatever is going on in life, whatever is causing anxiety, come to me and talk to me later on. No, when it's going on. So if your day starts out in stress and anxiety because the kids are driving you nuts, or it's at the end of the day and you're sitting there in your routine with the kids and trying to get them to bed, what does God say? Pray through it. Talk to me. Cast that anxiety on me as it's happening because I care about it. When you're sitting there in bed at night and all of a sudden you're thinking about that next day when you're going into work and your mind starts to get that little dread factor going on, what do you do then? Wait till tomorrow and see what happens? No, cast your anxiety on him right then and there because he cares for you. When there's some health thing that's kind of scaring you a little bit and you're not sure what's going on in your body or someone that you love and it starts building up inside you, what does he say to do with it then? Cast your anxiety on God because he cares for you. When there's something in the social media or media that you're sitting there and watching and it's troubling you and bothering you, do you just click on more videos to watch more videos? Is that what he says? Cast your anxieties on God because he cares for you. Whatever it is, no matter if it's the biggest stuff that's bothering you or just what seems like minute little problems like you're getting stuck in line and it's bothering you. That happens to me all the time. He says, cast your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Bring it to God. I was sitting there and I was trying to think of what image would really kind of bring this across. And so, I did, what every good pastor does. I Google the phrase, right? Cast your cares on God. And I was sitting there and, the literal translation of cast your cares is one that is like throwing something out or throwing something away from yourself. And I saw an image that came up right away of this guy throwing a net away from him. And it said, cast your cares on God. And I was like, oh, that's beautiful. That's that real visual thing of casting something out. And then I went, oh, no, that's the wrong image. Why? Because what do you do with a net after you throw it out? Then you what? Pull it back in. I'm like, no, that's wrong. That is all wrong. God doesn't say cast your anxieties on him and then drag it back into the boat. Cast it on him because he cares for you and leave it there. Saw this image and I was thinking, no, that's probably supposed to be the woman that comes to Jesus and her sins are causing her so much shame and anguish that she lays down at Jesus' feet and she wipes his feet with her hair, right? But I thought, what happens at the end of that story? She gets up and what? Walks away. Did she bring her sins with her when she walked away? No, she left them at the feet of Jesus. That's casting your cares on Jesus. There was a pastor that was speaking a couple weeks ago to a conference that Greg and I were at, And he had this kind of cool imagery. And he said, one of the things I invite my congregation to do in church is whenever they come to the Lord's Supper, and I know we don't have it at late service, so hold on to this one till next week, I guess. As he said, I invite them that when they come to the Lord's Supper, that when they come up before the altar, they think about the fact that they are coming up before the physical presence of Jesus. It's almost like his hands and feet are sitting there to touch you, right? And as you come before the altar, he said, then I invite you to say a word, to say a name, something that's bothering you or troubling you, and say it before the altar, and then leave it there and walk away. I like that. So I encourage you all to consider it. You can do it silently or with a quick little word, however you want to do it in the future, or throw my idea out. But I thought that was a really powerful image. That is what we do in church, and you can do it in your prayers too. As we sit there and we say these words to Jesus, and then we leave them with him, and we walk away. And if it comes back to you again, do you know what you do that time too? Give it to Jesus and walk away again. Keep repeating and keep trusting that God who describes himself as caring for you means it. He cared for you enough to suffer on the cross. And so he cares enough about all those other sufferings in your life too. Amen? Amen.